So welcome. My name is Paul Goode. I'm the Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. While this discussion is occurring online, I would like to acknowledge that Carleton University is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. In doing so, we acknowledge that we have a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. Today, we are entering the 58th day of Russia's war in Ukraine. As the war continues, international attention and support has rightly focused on Ukraine and what it will take for the war to end. A big part of that discussion concerns the domestic side of the war in Russia. And today's question for discussion is deliberately provocative. Do Russians support the war? Now, I think to dispense with the obvious, many support the war and many oppose it. Many support Putin even if they oppose the war. Many support the war even if they oppose Putin. It's a complicated picture, right? And increasingly, the repressive environment in Russia makes it difficult to know the nature and extent of support for the war. So our goal today is not to justify Russia's war, but to question the question of popular support plays a key role, I think, in determining Russia's resolve to stay in the war. And it will matter a great deal for understanding the Russia that emerges from it. We are very fortunate today to have 4 experts on Russian politics join us this morning, each of whom brings a distinctive approach to bear on the question. I've asked each of our speakers to talk for no more than 15 minutes so that we will have ample time for discussion. I will also be posting the speakers' bios in the chat box. For our audience members, please use the Q&A box to submit your questions, and know that you can submit questions at any time during the presentations, and we will address as many of them as possible in the Q&A period after the speakers' presentations. So without any further ado, I think we'll just head directly to the speakers. Our first speaker for today is Elizaveta Gaufman from University of Groningen. Lisa.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm honored to be in such a great lineup today. So my area of expertise is related to social media, and I'll be talking actually in more detail about what the social media have to say about the war. And just a quick caveat, I've been looking at social media related to Ukraine since 2013, so since the Euromaidan, and I've been tracking pretty much the same echo chambers, social media groups that have been engaged into Ukraine talk for a while now, so almost 10 years. And I think that especially when we talk about the current war, it's important to know that there's 2 things that usually people point out. There's the so-called Crimea consensus and the so-called Donbas consensus. And when we talk about the Crimea consensus, which is the consensus of 2014-2015, so the Crimea annexation, this was way more of a consensus, especially on all over Russia and all over social media as well. So if you compare the discourse around the annexation of Crimea, around the war, because there was a war in Donbass in 2014-2015 as well. And if you talk about this narratives that were circulating on Russian social media, what was extremely important for Russians at that point in time was the seemingly completely bloodless takeover of Crimea. So this is something that was emphasized time and again, and all of these t-shirts that were on sale back in the day. You might remember some of those catchphrases from the time when people were talking about the little green men or polite men. So polite takeover. Even Putin got the title of the most polite president. So this seemingly bloodless takeover of Crimea was hailed as what's the Russian army and what Russia was about. So a big part of that consensus was not just the fact that Russia achieved its or reconfirmed its great power status, that Russia asserted itself against the United States, which was a big part of the narrative at that point in time, was also the fact that it happened bloodlessly. It was just a competent army that managed to take over Crimea and then conducted the referendum, and everybody just lived happily ever after, so to say. And this was, again, reiterated time and again through consumer practices, through social media discourse, through a lot of different ways to emphasize the fact that there was no war. And even a lot of people that were following the hostilities, it was still seen as something that was external, not necessarily something that Russia was even participating in. Obviously, there was a lot of externalization happening via traditional media, where there was a special term for soldiers that were involved in the war. They were called "Ich tam niety," so they are not there. So the soldiers, they're not there. And a lot of the public opinion polls at the time also indicated that even if Russian army was there, it's okay. But the official consensus was there was no blood, nobody got hurt, and only those who got hurt were in Odessa, in this trade union house, and Ukraine never investigated that. So this was the narrative, and also on social media. And obviously on social media, it was a lot, the discussion was revolving around the Ukrainian Nazi narrative. And this was a massive legitimation point in 2014 as well. So one of the massive reasons for the Crimea consensus for the support of the annexation was the fact that the Russian mainstream media managed to successfully frame the conflict around Crimea and with Ukraine as a conflict between Ukrainian Nazis and Russian anti-fascists. So this was done pretty skillfully by emphasizing the role of right sector or showing footages of right sector marches in Ukraine, or support for Stepan Bandera. So that's why even Putin still uses this term Banderovцы, even though he mispronounces it for some reason as Banderovцы. This figure of Stepan Bandera was hailed also as one of the leaders of the seemingly Ukrainian Nazis. So this was a narrative that was quite readily bought on social media and beyond it, because there is some historiographical tradition in Soviet Union and modern Russia to emphasize Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis. So the fact that Ukrainians are Nazis now was something that a lot of people could believe based on the information that we received from mainstream media. And when Crimean annexation happened, it was something that, again, was framed as reunification. And again, it was even perceived as that outside of Russia as well. So there were a lot of political leaders who actually said, oh, well, it was Russian anyway. So this was the attitude also outside of Russia at that point in time. And social media were specifically focused at that point in time on this narrative that Ukrainians seem to be Nazis and we need to fight against them because it's kind of a World War II 2.0. We need to fight them, and this is a good and just war against Ukraine. And Henry Hale, who's also here, he at that point in time, he also did a public opinion poll where he showed that a lot of Russians even didn't want to marry into Ukrainian families because the anti-Ukrainian sentiment was so high. And it reached the level of anti-Semitism in Russia, which is really hard to do. So this is something that was 2014, 2015. There was almost an overwhelming consensus that Ukraine was a new Nazi state and Russia had to fight against it, and Crimea annexation was just. But once the election of Vladimir Zelensky happened, this actually changed quite a bit. And even on social media, a lot of people on this anti-Maidan groups, for example, they were quite confused. Okay, if Ukraine is such a neo-Nazi state, why would they elect a Jewish, Russian-speaking guy who was famous on Russian TV? So this was a massive, massive blow to this cognitive schemata, so to say, about Ukraine as a neo-Nazi state, as a fascist junta, as Putin called it. And I think that that was probably also the time when a lot of the anti-Ukrainian sentiment started to go down significantly, especially on social media. Also, the discussions around Ukraine simmered quite a bit. And you could also see the numbers in this anti-Ukrainian groups also go down. So if at the height of Euromaidan, you see those Facebook groups that of Kontakte groups that were about 500, 600, almost 600,000 people monitoring the news about Ukraine. Suddenly, their membership went down by about 100,000, 150,000. So you could see even the interest really went down, even though technically we're still concerned with what the United States is doing with Ukraine and how they're trying to meddle and create an anti-Russia. So this was also something that the narrative never went away, so it was still there. But everything changed on the 24th of February, of course. So, and people are talking about the so-called Donbas consensus, where people still support the war, and there are people who support the war, or at least support the special operation in Ukraine, which is the official name for it, and this is actually illegal in Russia to call it war. So you have a special law against discrediting Russian armed forces, and according to that law, it's illegal to call the war war. That's why you have this spoofs on social media where it says Leo Tolstoy's special operation and peace. So people are consciously making fun of that as well. But what is drastically different from the so-called Crimean consensus is the fact that people, even if you call it a special operation, it still has many more hallmarks of a war. And people see those dead bodies as that coming into Russian regions, not to Moscow, interestingly enough, but in many Russian regions, you see funerals of high-ranking officers, even generals sometimes. And this is the kind of information that starts to seep into general public. So there are victims, people are dying, cities are getting destroyed, maybe not even by the Russian forces, because the Russian TV would say, and even Russian social media always accuse the Ukrainian side of bombing their own cities, which is very reminiscent of the Russian saying of bombing Voronezh. And it seems like they want to accuse Ukraine of doing the same thing. The interesting part about social media right now is that there are way more cracks that you can see on social media. Even among people who do support the war, they do not like the way it's going. So you either have this very jingoistic pockets of social media where people are just saying, oh, we need to kill all Ukrainians. And they're not happy with the pace of the invasion. So they want to amp it up, and they want to really make sure that there's no such thing as Ukraine. I mean, even the former head of the separatists in the Donbas, Igor Strelkov-Kirkin, he's been also called Ukraine, so-called Ukraine. So he's not even calling the country by its name. So there are pockets of social media who are behaving this way, who want to destroy Ukraine as a country. But even those pockets of war support are not necessarily recognized by the Russian government as trustworthy enough. So one of the big names in Russian nationalism, Igor Kholmogorov, for example, was even denied permit for a rally in support of the war. So all of this kind of seemingly grassroots organization that you can see that are seemingly supporting the war, all of these events are completely state organized. And there is no genuine grassroots support for the war that's actually spilled on the streets. The one way that you can see it is on social media. So the kind of narratives that are being pushed through social media that people are saying this is, there is little actually variation to the kind of narratives you saw in 2014, 2015. The massive one red line that's been happening on social media throughout the time Crimea annexation, Donbas war, and Donbas invasion. It's been this recurrent narrative of save Donbas children. So this is something that they've been talking about for a while now. And even now, when you see a lot of this responses on social media when somebody is against the war, the first response that they get, where have you been for the last 8 years? Do you not care about Donbas children? And this is the kind of narrative that you can see on RT, that you can see on mainstream TV as well in Russia, and on social media by extension, where the pro-war fraction actually accuses of not caring about the war against Donbas in the last 8 years. So this is, however, not a new narrative. So this has been going on for a while, and those in, let's say, anti-Maidan group on Kontakte would have been talking about Donbas for all these 8 years. So they probably are frustrated that suddenly what they are talking about is something that nobody used to care about. And another issue here is that even among those who support the war, I mentioned it's kind of very very jingoistic segment, there's also this part of the war somewhat support. So you have people who really hail the recognition of Donbass and Luhansk Republic. So those people who hailed the reopening of the canal, the water canal to Crimea. But now that they see all the casualties and all the blood, not necessarily Ukrainian blood, even the Russian blood, they start thinking and they start getting increasingly uneasy with it. So if you take a look at the comment section and in some of those pro-war groups and even anti-Ukrainian groups, there's a lot of hesitance about the war. So because it kind of comes in the conflict with this largely post-Soviet, even Russian and to a certain extent, ethos of as long as there is no war, лишь бы не было войны. So this kind of as long as there is no war, it's okay. But now there is war, and you see casualties from it, and some of the familial relations that also show that there is in fact wars, that there are displaced people. So something is definitely not going according to plan. And this definitely is giving pause to a lot of people who are actually, even on those very anti-Ukrainian, very seemingly patriotic, well, what they call themselves patriotic segments of social media, they are starting to become increasingly uneasy with the level of destruction and violence that is happening in Ukraine, and the fact that Russia is directly responsible for it, even if they might not know everything about it. So in that regard, it's very, there obviously is the anti-war fraction, but a lot of it is increasingly immigrating from Russia. A lot of it is increasingly scared of speaking out. And it's very hard to pinpoint what the numbers are right now. So there was a really nice caricature recently that I saw where you had somebody was asking a person whether they support the war, and they put a gun to their head. So in that regard, it's quite apt to describe the the way the polling works actually in Russia right now, and the way social media are also working right now, because obviously Facebook is blocked, Instagram is blocked, Telegram is still free, Vkontakte is very heavily monitored by Russian security services. So whatever you say on social media is also very much under scrutiny, not necessarily by the state, but also by some by people who might even report it to the Center E, so the extremist center in the Russian security services. So that's why it's very hard to give the exact numbers that might exist in Russian society right now. And some of the list survey experiments actually confirm that the numbers in support of the war are actually much lower than are officially reported. So what I can say from my side is that social media definitely show that even in very heavily monitored police environments, you still see doubts about the war. And I think that these doubts will start to spread and multiply, because the scale of the war will be more and more known to regular Russians, and the impact of the sanctions will be felt more and more. And as the old saying goes, that the Russian state will change only when people in Russia would start listening to their fridges and not their TV. So we'll see what happens. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that, for those insights, and a wonderful way to begin our discussion today, I think. Our next speaker is Henry Hale from George Washington University.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and all the organizers and other panelists and everybody here. I think this is a very important discussion. I'm honored to be part of it and very much look forward to the feedback that we get here collectively. I guess in general, I mean, there's so much to talk about here. Fortunately, we have a great team to break it up. But what I want to touch base on a little bit is kind of what the pre-war pattern of public opinion was, how the Kremlin talked about what was happening as the invasion was set up, and then what this might mean for public opinion and support for the war and for Putin going forward. And I think in general, I mean, it strikes me that the way the Kremlin set the population up for the invasion means that it has to sustain a big lie about it, which is in reality, very heavy propaganda lift, and it's having some success at the moment, but I think that there are reasons to believe that in the longer run, this is going to be a big problem for the Kremlin. So if we look at pre-war opinion in Russia, I think we can see a number of patterns. I'd be happy to elaborate on any of these, kind of what leads me to these general observations. First of all, of course, there's a strong belief that NATO and the United States are threats, so significant threats to Russia, that the president of Russia has to stand up to these entities. But at the same time, there was also very consistently throughout the Putin era a desire for Russia to treat the West better than the West was treating Russia. So, if you ask the question, how is the West treating Russia? How is the United States treating Russia? The majority would say, well, it's as an enemy or as a rival, not as an ally or partner or a friend. But if you ask people how Russia should treat the West, the majority of responses has consistently, up until December 2021, been that Russia should be treating the West more as an ally, a partner, and as a friend than as an enemy or a rival. And what's actually quite interesting is that people actually saw Putin as favoring that more moderate response. And so let me just share a slide here from the 2021 version of the Russian election studies surveys. So again, this is a survey that's been long running ever since 1995, timed to every Russian election. Let me just kind of pull up the, here we go. Let's see. Okay, so can people see the slide here? And so basically, this is a survey that was done with a very large sample, face-to-face interviews across Russia, and it asked people directly, what should Russia do in the war in Ukraine, and allowed them to choose as many answers as they wanted. And what's striking here is that only 8% opted to support sending Russian armed forces to participate in combat in Ukraine on the side of the Ukrainians who were fighting there, right? And so, this is exactly what was actually done. And only 9% more were willing to support training and supplying weapons to Ukrainians fighting the Kiev authorities, right? So, and again, this isn't just which option you prefer most and which you would accept. This is like anything that people thought should be done. The vast majority of people, as you can see, wanted, at most maybe to supply moral support, humanitarian aid. A full third thought that Russia should not be involved at all in this conflict, with another 8% finding it hard to say. I think, this tells us a number of things, but I think what's interesting to me is that the public was not like pushing for this war. There wasn't even much evident latent support for the war. Putin's support has been more as a perceived, that is, he tried to position himself as the cool head of reason against this hysterical, potentially aggressive West. And the rhetoric leading up to February 24th was very much consistent with this. I mean, up until very close to the invasion, the foreign ministry and others were ridiculing the West for predicting an invasion. It's like, nobody's talking about an invasion. And instead, this was used as part of a stoking up of a sense of Western threat that, well, actually, this is the West just being hysterical, unreasonable. And so in the end, I think partly what this means is that to be on brand and to be consistent, given its own setup for what happened, the Kremlin has to convince people of this a big lie. And as was just mentioned, it can't call this an invasion or a war, because it was crazy to talk about an invasion or a war, right? So you can't call it that. It has to be a special military operation. The framing, as the previous speaker also noted, which I think is very important, is needed to be consistent with past Kremlin narratives. And in this case, what the Kremlin line makes sense. Kiev was taken over by Nazis in illegal coup in 2014. So we're aiming to just get rid of those Nazis and restore a more normal constitutional order through this military operation. And I think the biggest propaganda lift, though, that's kind of the biggest break with what, I mean, it's not exactly a break, but the kind of new element to me is that it had to make the case to the public that this military operation, which is going to be significant, even if it's not, admitted that it's a full-scale operation, was immediately necessary, that Russia's existence was at stake. And so our host here, Paul Goode, has a great policy memo on how the Russian media were talking about the reasons for the invasion, in particular in the weeks after it happened, as I recall. And this struck me, and just like looking at Russian media myself, trying to monitor it, is kind of almost a spaghetti at the wall approach, trying to convince people, see what sticks, that Russia's existence is at stake, right? It's everything from, Ukraine was about to go nuclear, the United States and Ukraine were colluding to, basically cultivate diseases targeted to the Russian genome that would be spread by migrating birds going back from, the Ukrainian southeast to Russia, and so on. It also, I think, is very important as part of what it had to do to sustain this narrative, and I think has done to some extent successfully, is to very much I guess preempt, or maybe even in a way immunize the population against the flow of actual information. And so it struck me it's very they're very creative and proactive and in thinking about this, right? So if you watch like this First Channel or something, right, it's all about how basically, the Nazis typically use human shields, right? They'll place tanks near hospitals. And so it's not just, they won't wait necessarily until an atrocity happens and then try to explain it away, which they do, and are very attentive to doing that, but they prime people to think that, well, this is all part of an information operation. Ukrainian secret police are basically monitoring very carefully social media discourse in Ukraine and sometimes forcing people to reverse their positions. So what you read from your family members coming, who are saying that Russian bombs are dropping, Russian shells are falling in my apartment building, they're just forced to do that they're forced to say that, to save themselves from Ukrainian security services. And then, of course, the final, not the final, but the last one that I'll mention, element of all this has to be to convince people that the negative consequences that Russia is suffering because of all this, including from sanctions, were either necessary, such as some soldiers having, but not conscripts, having to, give up their lives for the sake of duty. But also that, Putin's line has been that, well, sanctions were inevitable, right? It's like, okay, you're going to suffer, but you were going to suffer anyway. You're so naive if you don't think that was the case. So even the bad stuff can be kind of explained away. And I think that in public opinion, we've seen some evidence this has been supportive, right? So in public opinion, there was maybe initially kind of what, to me struck me as a little weaker than expected, relatively weak support for even saying you supported the war in a public opinion poll, given how much propaganda there was in support of it. But this has seemed to have risen, as have reports of polls done on support for Putin. The last polls I saw indicated that it was up kind of 80% area, way up from what it had been before in the 60s. Getting close to the Crimea levels. And it's not clear to me that we should be treating these polls as any more or less different or artificial than in the past. Levada Center, for example, from what I've seen about their, I saw some of their figures on response rates to their surveys, and they've basically been the same, throughout, as they were throughout 2021. Kind of about a third of people responding. So there hasn't been a dramatic decline in response rates or other patterns that might indicate a wholesale withdrawal of people's willingness to participate in opinion polls, right? Like the numbers of people refusing to answer questions, that kind of thing. We've seen similar patterns before, right? As kind of Syria, initially there wasn't popular majority supporting Russian intervention there, but then, in response to the propaganda, there was. I think more generally, right? I mean, one of the things we know is Putin has the ability to lead public opinion. Sometimes polls ask about this and about certain questions, and there's a significant share of people who just say, well, yeah, if Putin supported it, I would support it. But I think the big message, that I would take away from the polls is, of course, that we always have to treat polls with caution, whether it's in democratic or authoritarian societies, but especially in the latter, and especially when you have such high social pressures, to appear patriotic and whatnot. So the key, I think, is just interpretation. So again, each of these things one could talk about a lot. Hopefully other people will comment on this as well. So I expect that a lot of the support expressed in the polls is real, as Paul alluded to at the beginning. But at the same time, I do think that probably also a good amount of this support is insincere. It doesn't mean a majority of that support is insincere, but a substantial component. There was an interesting study that was circulated, posted on a blog, done at LSE, which used a technique called the list experiment, which is a way of basically allowing people to express their view on a subject in a way that they can't ever be nailed down on, right? So, but basically what it found was that, about like 2/3 of the population said in a direct question that they supported the war, but far fewer actually did support the war, but that far fewer was still like a slight majority. So that indicates there's still substantial support, but at least I think it's interesting evidence that there is at least some of what political scientists or economists would call preference falsification, people responding insincerely. But at the same time, I think this is one of the fields that political science needs to be better at, is just that there are going to be a lot of responses that are kind of in between in there. People who maybe don't agree with the action, but think, well, my country, right or wrong. People who agree with some parts of the war aspects, not others. Passive or ignorant agreement, deferral of one's own opinion to others' opinion or to the majority opinion, kind of outsourcing your own opinion formation process. And I think this is all typical of rallying. One of my recent studies found that, even in the Crimea rally, which, is pretty generally believed had a large sincere component, there are a substantial share of people that, were reporting in opinion polls that they supported Putin when they didn't as a result of the Crimea rallying. So just to conclude, in terms of what the future might bring, the research on rallying around the flag shows that rallying typically fades after a few months. But most research on rallying is done in democratic societies where you have alternative sources of information. Putin has a lot more, obviously, a lot more means of reinforcing the continuation of the rally. And in that context, there's a danger that war takes on a logic of its own, right? Real grievances start to build as real people kill other real people across ethnic or national lines. But I think my general feeling is that in the long run, what tends to matter most is generalized affect, right? Just a general mood of positivity or negativity that tends to be created, which then goes on to shape how people think about their incumbent leaders. And the dominant affect in Crimea was something like euphoria or joy. Whereas this war is much more about negative emotions. It's about anxiety, fear of threat, senses of duty in the face of that. Over the long run, even if people blame the West for sanctions and blame the West for the whole conflict, you're going to have just a sense of negativity that comes out of this because of these losses. That won't even be a conscious thing, like, well, I blame X and therefore I blame Putin for this, therefore I feel it. But just the general sense of negativity, in the same way that like research has shown that towns where you have a shark attack happens, the leaders the leaders' ratings go down, right? The mayor's ratings go down, right? It's kind of doesn't make any sense, but it's that general sense of negativity or positivity. And so I suspect that over the long run, with the deaths and economic problems, they're likely to take its toll. Again, the question is when. Happy for all of us to discuss that. Maybe some will, but let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. I think we've already got now a great deal to discuss as it is. And I'm glad to see we do have some questions starting to come into the Q&A box. So just a reminder to our audience members that you are able to submit a question to the Q&A box at any point in time. And we will continue to filter through these and try to address as many as possible in the Q&A session. Now, our next speaker is Jeremy Morris from Aarhus University.
Thank you, and thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks for the audience for coming, and my illustrious co-panel members. And it's very hard to follow them, really. We heard so much from Lisa particularly about social media, and then from Henry about polling, and it's hard to follow that. My area of research and expertise is as an anthropologist who collects longitudinal field materials through lots of interviews and immersion in the field, sitting and talking and listening to people over many, many years, particularly with the same set of interlocutors who I go back to year after year after year, which in one sense means that the war is an incredible challenge, because I'm not in Russia, I'm in Denmark. And just like them, just like you, I was incredibly shocked when the war began. I was convinced that it would not happen. And then I'm presented with this incredible difficulty. How do I speak to these interlocutors? How do I gauge, how do I find out the answer to the question that we've been asked here, do Russia support the war? And it's impossible really to answer that question, because as soon as it starts, people are in shock and do not want to answer that question. And this relates to what Henry was talking about, how much we trust polls, how the meaning of polls changes once war is declared, and the meaning of polls in democratic and non-democratic regimes. And the same is true of my own research. How I speak to people obviously changes, because I am now a representative of the West, which in the Russian propaganda is increasingly, as we've seen as the war's gone on, being labeled as the main adversary, arming and equipping Ukraine and whatnot. So nonetheless, I have tried to speak to a variety of people, and after a little while, I came up with a term as an alternative to rally around the flag. So immediately, as we heard from Henry, there is this clearly well-observed effect that has mainly been studied in more democratic societies of rally around the flag. And my preference was for this term, defensive consolidation. Now, why say this instead of rally around the flag? In my view, this does kind of work as a catch-all for people's responses. And it starts with this shock and disbelief, and then denial, denial of the revanchist and neo-imperialist aims of the Russian state, and denial of the what is to us completely self-evident, the destruction by Russian forces of large amounts of the material infrastructure and, of course, human lives in Ukraine. So defensive consolidation is a form of coping with cognitive dissonance. So it starts from denying that the Russian leadership and that the army could possibly be guilty of war crimes or criminal aims. And as this becomes clearer and clearer over the days and weeks that massive destruction is happening, even to people who only consume mainstream Russian news on television, it leads to a buying in, at least superficially, and I want to emphasize superficiality, which would connect again to what some of our other speakers have already mentioned, superficiality of opinion, right? Its malleability, its changeability, right? A buying into a general belief that the Ukrainian leadership is to blame, or that the Ukrainian leadership is a puppet of the West, or that my country of origin, Britain, is somehow this super manipulative geopolitical actor that has these perfidious designs on Russia, right? And so I think now defensive consolidation is best expressed as this kind of superficial buying into the idea that this is a geopolitical conflict provoked by the West, right? So I hear, when I talk to people now, I hear again and again the same story. So if in the beginning we had shock and denial, disbelief, people just not being able to discuss it, now I think we're getting to the point where people, with some hesitation and not with confidence, default to this reaction where they say, oh, well, you know, this confrontation was inevitable. Yeah, the inevitability of conflict, which then reflects this elite construction of the conflict, right, as geopolitical confrontation. Also, what has been mentioned, the struggle for survival of Russian civilization comes up. So you can see again, I think, why I would use this this term, defensive consolidation. And also, despite what Henry was saying about rising support for Putin, there's very little mention of the war leadership, of the defense minister, of the government even. And again, that's why I would prefer this to rally around the flag. So there's little mention in positive terms of leadership, of even the political order in Russia, the regime. In a sense, it could be thought of as a distorted, rebooted version of certain even Cold War tropes and Soviet era ways of thinking about geopolitics, encirclement, marginalization, and confrontation. So in a sense, it could be thought of as a kind of reactivation of a dormant defensive mindedness. And maybe this indicates, again, consolidation, in that it shows a closing of the gap between elite political narratives and what I would call lay political narratives, everyday political narratives, right? So in the worldview of many Russians, this is the closest they can come to a form of essentialized truth of the situation that is palatable to them, right? So they can't think of it as a revanchist war by a completely insane political elite in charge of their country. They can make it palatable to themselves by defaulting to this this view of geopolitical conflict between East and West. So how did I get to that? Well, really by a very roundabout route. I've argued in a recent article on a completely different subject, an article in Europe-Asia Studies from 2021 that was about everyday homophobia and really the reflection in everyday talk of, again, elite propagandistic tropes of the decadent, permissive West as a threat to Russian values. Some people call it the conservative turn. That article, based again on in-depth interviewing and qualitative materials, led me to challenge and really think more deeply about the ineffectiveness or the incoherence of the transmission of elite ideology to the wider public, right? So again, there's this hypodermic model, which has been really critiqued a lot about the media's effect on publics. And so instead of thinking of this kind of a transmission belt, right, between elite signaling and public response, which again you might be able to measure in opinion polling, I started to turn to a number of other models of thinking about cultural identity, and I found particularly Raymond Williams' idea of structures of feeling useful. which is broadly an idea about how socially accepted common sense changes over time. But also in a more recent work, the work of the British anthropologist Michael Herzfeld, who coins this term cultural intimacy. So both of these ideas are how hegemony actually works in the everyday context. And both of these ideas also make space for political reinterpretations, recuperations, and take seriously how ordinary people respond as political subjects in their own right, rather than as just objects who are vessels then filled by ideological messaging, right? Both of these writers, Herzfeld and Williams, pay attention to the way there are openings and closings of gaps between official discourse and popular responses. So these are dynamic processes. And so I would say, if whether we call it rally around the flag or defensive consolidation, which I prefer, it indicates a relative closing of the gap between regime and people and public. But again, defending my terminology, I would say what makes it perhaps different from rally around the flag is that it draws on this deeper and more long-term set of cultural set of ideas that are perhaps quite dislocated in time and place, really, from the present. So it includes nostalgia for perhaps not an imperial project, but a great power project, or even a supranational state project, USSR project, resentment against a collective West, again, which goes back to the Soviet period, and even social dislocation in the period of post-communist transition. And even, as many other sociologists have argued, the loss of a normative socius in general. So I think we should be really careful about assuming a natural hyper-nationalistic or even hyper-patriotic constituency. And again, if we just look at the response to the invasion, as Henry and Lisa both mentioned, I think, you actually don't have a strong, unprompted grassroots mobilization. Indeed, that would be seen as dangerous by the elites, by the regime. And if we even take visible expressions of loyalty and support, the Z campaign, the Z that people that we see in lots of public places, there is actually quite little spontaneous use of that. It seems to be, part of propagandistic theatre as much as anything else. And Lisa spoke about social media. Again, I would really support her point that there are jingoistic, chauvinistic pockets, but that does not prove widespread enthusiasm for the war. So in the minute or so that I have left, of course, I am not denying there is a pro-war constituency, but I would emphasize that, in my own talks, in the limited way that we can speak about it, there continues to be shock, disbelief, denial, and there is very, very, lukewarm responses, fears, anxiety, something that Henry mentioned. Definitely, I detect that. Moving forward, I also think that things are changing so quickly that we should be really, really, really careful in saying, oh, clearly there is a big pro-war constituency. Clearly there is rally around the flag. Why? Because it's extremely early days, and the effects of sanctions, the effects of economic dislocation are only just starting to be felt in Russia. I've said it before and I'll say it again, the summer, and the end of the summer in particular, we'll see most ordinary Russians affected by the war materially for the first time, because that's when they would expect prices to go down on foodstuffs. they will go up. That is when, if they've been on furlough, they will lose their jobs. And that is when, if they are in their jobs now, still earning, they will see significant cuts to their standard of living. And that's where the proof of the pudding will be at the end of the summer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I think we've got now an impressive range of perspectives already to discuss. Just a quick note for our audience members. I see some of you have hands raised. The chat box is disabled for audience members, but you are more than welcome to post questions into the Q&A box. And we have a number of questions that we will already be addressing after our last presentation. Our last presentation is Professor Gulnaz Sharafutdinova from the Russian Institute of King's College London. Gulnaz, please.
Thank you very much. Oh, I was impatiently waiting. So thank you so much for organizing this extremely important set of issues, and thank you to all the panelists and excellent, a lot of great ideas. And so I wanted to share mine, and in the benefit of time, I'll try to express my thoughts in trying to be focused. And if something becomes a bit too schematic, we can address it during the Q&A period. So first of all, I wanted to raise a question about the question. I wasn't planning to do that, but I think actually it's something that's important to do, given that in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the media attention, for us as scholars, it's too easy to follow the frames and the questions that are posed to us by public media. And we need to be careful in picking up those questions. And so will I write an article, a scientific article, to publish with the question, do Russians support the war? I will not. Let me try to explain why. I think that question makes the issue a bit too banal and normalized, because the situation, the context of war and the way this war is playing out, just by the fact of the war being waged, is existential for millions of people, right? We will not deny that. So asking a question, do Russians support a war? And making it banal to the extent that, do Russians support reforming Gazprom, reforming their parliament? Do the Russians support, I don't know, membership in NATO? Those are political questions that, you know, allow us to gather information, surveys, etc. But when we ask about a war, it's a bit like a question like, do Russians like their children? Or why is that? Similar to why, you know, do Russians like their children? Because the war is fought by Russian children, right? So I think we need to be careful with this question also because of how it is recognized and responded to by our, you know, in this case, objects of research, right, by the Russians themselves. And I think what Jeremy also was referring to a little bit in the in your references to your conversations, and if I can add to that, that when we ask Russian citizens, Russian people, do you support a war? They probably, in many cases, see it as a question, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of your army, your president, you know, your children, or not, right? So I would put the war issue as an existential issue that is different from the times of normal politics, and that we need to treat it as a bit different from other topics and issues that we discuss. So that's my first point. And in my own attempt, okay, I'm contributing to this panel. I want to talk about these issues. I've been thinking about them a lot, and in parallel, of course, I will not go into the story of all the difficult reactions, of course, but the way that I found an answer to what is an interesting question for me in terms of trying to understand the reaction of Russian people to war was brought to me, in fact, just yesterday in terms of articulation from just a few readings. And one of them is a reading by Zygmunt Bauman, Polish sociologist, who, following Hannah Arendt, wrote a book, Modernity and Holocaust, where a big question that was asked was about how can we understand the process of moral distancing that in his case, he was looking into the German society, and he was looking into the German people who were collaborating with the Nazis and who were involved in killings. And the presupposition and the assumption was that normally all human beings are against killing and they find it morally reprehensible. So to be engaged in killing, we need to understand what are those emotional and cognitive mechanisms that are involved in creating a distance between people who are engaged in it. Now, I do not want to make a parallel in the sense that we are talking about people who are not engaged in killings. We're talking about people who are in the process of articulating their vision, their dispositions, their attitudes, their ideas about this war. However, the point about the issue of moral distancing, I think, captures the issue of people not necessarily involved in killing. So that is the question that, let me put a frame, that is the question that I would like to ask. And just to share what we found, and I will present a few graphs from a work, empirical work that we're doing with Alexandra Arkhipova, an anthropologist, based on the analysis of social media from Medialogia database. And with Alexandra Arkhipova, we collected the types of, basically the pro-war or the rationalizing cliches and the narratives that are commonly used by those Russians who are not actively engaged into anti-war effort or who are not clearly taking an anti-war position. Okay, so you will hear actually many things that were already said, but let me put a bit of the frame onto that discussion about the narratives and about the types of stories, narratives, ideas that many Russians use in the process of, and here my idea of, in the process of rationalizing their position, and in the process, therefore, in the end, of distancing themselves morally from the war and from the destruction, tragedy, the pain, and all the devastation involved in the results of this war that is fought at the name, on the name of the Russians. So I think it is very important to keep in mind the caveat of the pre-war public opinion patterns, as Henry noted, and two, that was an amazing observation about, I didn't know about that specific question that was asked in a Russian electoral survey about, what type of action you would support. And the numbers of 8 and 9% are extremely revealing and telling. I think another point that could be brought up is a more general, but also quite consistent observation about depoliticization that has been one of the key strategies for Putinism. And so we are dealing with a society where not many people were actively engaged in articulating their political position, and they found themselves thrown into the whirlwind, and they had to articulate their position one way or another, pressed with these morally difficult, painful situation. And so here, of course, my own sort of few years of focus on collective identity comes into play. And when we identified the key discursive types or blocks of narratives, we identified 4 blocks of narratives that, could be said were used by many Russians with who were not taking an active anti-war and anti-regime position to to articulate their position towards war. So the first narrative, and again Henry mentioned it, is the narrative of belonging, recognition of belonging to the national community, my country, right or wrong. I mean, this is the umbrella term, and let me share and show to you the, or maybe let me first go over the narratives and then I'll go over the graphs. So the first one is my country, right or wrong, and the key representative of this narrative is actually a very interesting quote from Sergei Bodrov. And it reads at basically, во время войны нельзя говорить плохо о своих, даже если они не правы. During the war, you cannot talk bad about your own people, even if they're not right. This, and I'll show you the graph how it shows, but this is just one of the narratives, and there are many others to support this. I would also support Jeremy's point about defensive consolidation, but in the process of this defensive consolidation, when people choose sides and what are the words and narratives they use, so there are quite a plenty of them, with the Bodrovs being quite an important one. The second important narrative is the other side of the coin of this one, my country, right or wrong. And you can easily guess. The second narrative, I refer to it in a right now preliminary term, it is all America's fault. But it's basically to focus on the other and on all the bad things associated with the other. So that's the other side of this narrative, the first one, but it's separate, right? Because it focuses on NATO expansion, on the United States actions and bombing in various countries around the world, etc. So I'll show some of these narratives as well. The third narrative that is also quite important is the narrative «Я человек маленький», or who am I to judge, right? I think it's important because these are blocks of different wordings. So finding a good umbrella term for these blocks is quite important. So if you have something catchy, please do contribute your ideas. This is, you know, I'm really presenting this, you know, with Alexandra. We're just in touch yesterday. Today she was sending me also some of the results of the Medialogia survey, Medialogia data. So this is very preliminary, and we are very much in the process of trying to unpack and articulate and look at the numbers and try to make sense of them. Therefore, all your criticisms, suggestions, advice is extremely important. So the third one is, who am I to judge? That means basically there is a obedience to authority. This, in fact, is quite similar to Baumann's observation about the German role of authority, which brings us to Milgram's experiments, etc. So it's there are some very interesting parallels there with things that have been discovered quite universally once again. In psychological terms, in terms of how human beings operate. And the final fourth one, and this is, I'm saying final up till now, we might come up with some other blocks, but we are working with these four for now. The final block of narratives is, let me also just catch it by the phrase, you cannot trust anyone. So this is the post-pravda, fake news, the epistemological uncertainty, we can call it, but that's another type of narrative that is used as Russians are trying to rationalize the war. So let me share now let's see, where is, okay, right here. So I hope in a second you should be seeing, maybe not in a, let's do the slideshow play from current, well, play from the start, but no, cancel, this didn't work for me. Okay, you see this, right? Yeah, okay, so let's look at the table, well, a graph that presents the data for social media. It also includes messengers, and but this doesn't include news from news sources. And this is about the specific term and it captures even the video clips from Sergei Bodrov's. It's an interview with Bodrov and few words. And if you remember, Bodrov is this cult personality from the famous films of Brother and Brother 2, Brat 2, Alexei Balabanov's. So this has been used, and it is still being used. And Sasha, just as I think Jeremy was speaking, sent to me yet another article from OVD Info, where people are sharing how they interact with Russian citizens, and how Bodrov's sentence comes in often. And I've had my own personal experiences with, being sent this specific little clip. And what I want to bring out your attention to on this graph is the immediacy of using this narrative. So the blue one captures the number of messages. The green one captures the auditorium, those who are exposed to this message. And I want to show just the jump in the use and sharing of this specific message. And I want to, bring an idea that this is due to the fact that it is this specific little clip that captures the national identification and my country right or wrong logic that people have used in order to help themselves right at the beginning of the war to take a position on the war. And the take a position on the war doesn't mean do you support the war, but who are you with and how do you behave during the war? Okay, now the next one, I apologize, I cannot get out of this.
No, I'm sorry, we're past 15 minutes. Could you please conclude your comments?
Okay, so let me just, these are the different narratives similar to the first one, but we need to consolidate around the president. This is my country. I will not go against my country. You do not select your motherland like your parents, and you see similar type of early jump in these narratives with another developing in April. So there are a few other ones. Now, it's all America's or Ukraine's fault. We see a very different distribution here. So again, note the difference from the early jump of the my country right or wrong, and a much more gradual distribution here. This one is Who Am I to Know? Я человек маленький. You have it in two waves. The first wave right after the war has begun. The second wave is around, and here we come to the issue of Bucha massacre, and that's where, and you cannot know the truth. This is another one where Bucha massacre stands out as Russians react to the evidence of Bucha massacre in one way or another. So no one knows. The truth is the jump here right after the beginning of April 2nd and 4th of April. We refer to Bucha here as a key thing here. Okay, so this is just things that I wanted to present, and let me stop at that. And of course, I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to Gulnaz, and also for all of our presenters. We have plenty of time, I think, for questions still, and I'm going to start by, I think, combining a few of the questions. As you can see, we've got quite a few in the box here. But this goes really to all the presenters, I believe, which is, to what extent does the widening awareness of the war in the Russian public, is it likely to affect in any way decision-making about the war? We know that the regime in the past has conducted its own polling. One of the questions asked, to what extent does government polling likely to differ from, say, Levada's polling? And how much does that actually then feed into what the government, chooses to do, either with the prosecution of the war or with the management of public opinion? Maybe we just go through quickly and ask each of the presenters to respond briefly before we continue on to other questions. Lisa, would you like to start?
Sure. The thing is that there was, especially in the run-up to the war, when all the military experts were saying that, oh, it's the war is coming, the war is coming, and a lot of us actually refused to believe that because there was no widespread barrage of propaganda to prepare the population for the war. And Paul, you also indicated yourself, even with your monitoring of your research on Integrum, that there was no kind of massive bombardment of propaganda on mainstream media. And I noticed the same thing on social media. There was not heightened alerts on social media, again, like the increased level of dehumanization of Ukrainians, for example, on social media as well. There was nothing like that. So the population was not ready for the war. And it was not prepared for the war. It was not prepared by propaganda towards the war. So this is something that shows either that Putin no longer cares about what the population thinks about the war, and together he was not expecting it to be bogged down as much in the war as he is right now, and also because of the massive repression that's been taking over the years, is that people would not care. So this kind of depoliticization that was also mentioned by previous speakers as well, this politicization would actually be enough to get people to not care about it. So I would say that there was definitely less of a, the public was not prepared. So this is, I think, was definitely a factor in the current attitudes towards the war as well, even though technically you had all this 8 years of the Save Donbass Children rhetoric, which I also noticed in the question as well, that why didn't you care about Donbass for 8 years? So, and the thing is that we did care, and we did condemn annexation of Crimea, and we did talk about the war all these years. But the thing is that by killing more Ukrainians, it's not going to solve the situation in Donbass. And so, yeah, that's my answer.
Great, thanks very much. Henry, would you like to respond?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I guess I also wouldn't expect a great deal of responsiveness, by Putin himself, certainly to public opinion, unless it were just some sort of massive turn against the war, some kind of big tip. But most likely that would manifest itself in other ways, forms of unrest that would, be more what would catalyze a change in Putin's support. But I think given what we've seen, he seems, this doesn't seem to have been an action that was planned by thinking, okay, this is going to be popular, therefore I'm going to do it and I'm going to boost my ratings. I think, he seems to really believe a lot of this stuff and is probably just going to do what he thinks needs to be done. And at least at this stage, rely on his own ability to try and bring public opinion around. So what I would think that it might shape, that they probably pay a great deal of attention to public opinion now as best they can, would be the propaganda message, right? So they're very good at kind of fine-tuning the message and trying to find other ways to justify it. But I think it would have to be something very big to actually shape Kremlin policy. What I would say, though, is if there is kind of clear evidence of a significant movement of public sentiment against the war, maybe that would affect kind of lower level officials and how they react in different ways. But again, I don't anticipate anything like that, like immediately, unless there's just some kind of huge, massive defeat that starts to take place. Thank
you very much. Jeremy, would you like to contribute?
So yeah, just really briefly to follow on. I mean, the fact that the war started in the first place indicates this massive disconnect between public opinion, whatever we think that is, as Henry's initial slide illustrated, and the regime, the elite, whatever. So why, in starting that war, why would we think then that the regime would respond to public opinion anyway? I'm just also thinking about COVID and other things, and how when things get really bad, the government itself tends to then the inner circle tends to then delegate to other parts of the regime, which doesn't really bode well.
Thanks very much. Gulnaz?
Just in 2 sentences, I think both the Kremlin and the people are intently watching what's happening on the front lines. And I think the people's overall anxiety, fear, and desire for war to end bodes well for Putin's, for the Kremlin's ability to sell any sort of potential outcome as a victory, as long as the Kremlin itself decides that it's ready to negotiate and come to certain terms. So I think, therefore, it's the Kremlin's decision-making that is central for deciding when that point is achieved.
Okay. Next question I'd like to highlight is, I think, more of a methodological question in a way, but I think it gets at the heart of some of the differences in the perspectives that have been presented by our speakers. Natalia Farrat asks about the dynamics of war support. When you have quantitative data that shows that it's grown over the past few weeks, qualitative data, including social media and interviews, paint a mixed picture. I think this also goes more closely to what Gulnaz was presenting with her social media data as well. On the one hand, sanctions seem to work for consolidation. On the other hand, the news about casualties and destruction, as well as inconsistencies of Russian propaganda, makes some people doubt whether they like what is going on. So how should we think about this? Are there opposite processes going on, and how flexible are Russians on those positions? Are they locked in, right? Or are they malleable or changeable? Gulnaz, would you like to start and respond?
Yes, absolutely. I think this idea of potentially conflicting processes on the way is a very good one, because on the collective level, it takes some time to assess for each individual what's the dominant idea and what's the dominant type of reaction to war. And that dominant reaction is based with media, but also conversations, and sort of the national identification is important again, so identity issues kick in, and so that dominant reaction is learned, and therefore people say, of course I'm supporting Putin. But at the same time, on the individual level, people encounter and also, of course, rationally understand the losses and the tragedy. And I think the certainty of the role of identification, the certainty in terms of having faith in the war goes down. And so we see more hesitancy and greater openness potentially to other types of thinking, but also desire for end of it also adds to the struggles, emotional struggles that people might have.
Thanks very much. Jeremy, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I kind of agree with what Gulnaz said. I mean, yes, my whole point was that there are conflicting processes even at the level of the individual, and they can vary over time in response to what Gulnaz said, that the media, people are responsive to the media, but as you said, Gulnaz, it also, the media comes up against reality at some point, right? And I would go back to what I said, which is that it is incredibly early days. The war, we saw the British government today saying that the war could last another 18 months at least, or again, as was indicated, the Kremlin could decide, when I said that, that they want to end it, and they could end it probably tomorrow if they decided to negotiate on terms amenable to the Ukrainian government. So I would just end by saying that I think the half-life of support for any armed conflict tends to decay extremely quickly when the reality kicks in, both the economic reality and, of course, the reality of what could be 20,000 odd combat deaths on the Russian side.
Thanks very much. Henry, do you have any thoughts on either whether these are different processes or how locked in Russians are in terms of public opinion?
I mean, I certainly think it is a complex process, right? It's a complex opinion landscape, and I think Gulnaz is absolutely right. I mean, even just to call it opinion, is sort of to do some brutal simplification of what's going on. I think what I guess the thing that I might just respond in addition to what's been said is just, on one hand, I mean, you have sort of a maybe kind of a face value response, right? Like, for example, to sanctions, right? It's the West. That's why I lost my job, or that's why I can't do what I normally would like to do on a weekday afternoon or something like that. But at a certain point, I mean, there's also kind of an effective response that comes about when one sees constrained life chances that may not even be kind of consciously formulated as like something that's blamable or not blamable, You know, and even if you're not making those connections, you still want your leadership to create some new opportunities for you. If you're you know, suffering, maybe you blame somebody for the for the initial thing, but then, okay, well, what's next? And I think, you know, people are experiencing all these things in different ways. You know, there's also differential sources of information. I mean, one thing that, you know, I found in some of the Crimea research of the Crimea effect is that, you know, people in Russia who had personal contacts with refugees from Ukraine were actually much less likely to publicly speak out in favor of, you know, or speak out as supporting Putin. So, you know, that's just even what an opinion poll could kind of tease out then. And so I think you're just going to have a very complex set of processes that I think these presentations here have been really great and helping us start to unpack and laying out an agenda for future research.
Thanks a lot. I'd be remiss not to point out sort of the irony that I start off with the assumption that the question of whether or not Russians support the war was a provocative question. And now there's pushback on whether or not the question itself was provocative enough, or even sort of does violence to the notion of public opinion. I do think public opinion is a direct kind of ways to gather and organize information, though. And we do
I don't
know
mean to dismiss that, yes, as one tool of research, right? So, yeah.
But we know, for instance, also that people will use war narratives as a way of justifying petty grievances, or they'll lock in whatever's going on in their life in a contingent moment into that dominant narrative as a way of justifying or rationalizing. And a lot of literature, of course, on everyday nationalism is precisely about this sort of thing, right? Lisa, from your work on everyday foreign policy, I wonder if you have a sense of like how this plays out in terms of if it helps us make sense of these opposite kinds of processes underway.
So again, I cannot give you exact numbers, and by my I've been looking at those narratives for years now. So for me, it's not necessarily some kind of new narratives that emerge around this war in Ukraine, although this time around, I mean. But what is interesting is that if in 2014 the term fascism was used way more frequently, but now the Russian government actually referred to the term Nazis, and the term denazification is making rounds. So this is something that's kind of a new spin on the narrative that was used in 2014. Although the whole idea of linking Ukraine with Nazism is actually not a very new narrative. It was also test driven in 2004 during the Orange Revolution, and also during Soviet eras. As I said, it was the whole Bandera issue was pretty much educated in Soviet history books. So this is something that's not new, but this kind of connection of the Ukraine West conjuncture. So this is Ukraine does not have any agency whatsoever, just a puppet of the West. So this is the kind of narrative that's also, again, been around for years now. And this is an issue that is related to a very imperial outlook from that a lot of Russians get from their history books. So it's Russia against the West, or sometimes personified by the United States. And then obviously nobody has any agency apart from these two countries. Everybody else is either has agency in relation to Russia or agency in relation to United States. So this is another issue that is very poignant in the discussion around Ukraine. That's why a lot of people might actually even support the war, see it as existential, because they think it's the West attacking Russia through Ukraine. So this is something that is very important to emphasize when we talk about it. As for methodological considerations, what I've been doing in my research, and hopefully when the book comes out, so what I was trying to do is also not just to track discourse, but also track practices around discourse, to actually, when it was possible, to do field work and to actually talk to people, do some research on consumer practices and see how actually whether discourse actually translates into offline action. So what you see on social media actually is translated into offline action. And one of the ways to actually track, for example, anxiety that was mentioned by other speakers in the Russian society is also, for example, the buckwheat prices. So if you take a look at the buckwheat prices, relates to the crisis in Russian society. So whenever there's some kind of pandemic, war, anything, so the prices go up and the consumption demand for buckwheat actually soars. So this is a much better indication for anxiety than analyzing emojis on social media in Russian society. So I would actually argue for trying to track consumer practices together with the discourse to see whether some of this online banter actually translates into offline action as well.
Super, thank you so much. I think in the time that we've got left, I'd like to sort of combine a couple more questions. And this has to do generally with sort of the role of soldiers, Russian soldiers in the conflict, and awareness of their role. And I think this manifests in a couple of different ways in the questions and in the discourse. One is with regards to soldiers who are contract soldiers as opposed to conscripts, and the political salience of involving conscripts in the process, especially given, as we know, there were early reports by the Committee on Soldiers' Mothers, for instance, that conscripts were being forced to sign contracts, shipped off to war without knowing where they were going. And then that became obviously very volatile within elite level politics within Russia. But at the same time, we also have lots of reports of foot dragging and sabotage being undertaken by Russian soldiers in Ukraine as forms that we would recognize as forms of resistance. And the extent to which those soldiers ultimately are in contact with people back in Russia and are potentially influencing the ways that their families and people in their networks think about the war. So what is how salient is that connection then between conscripts, between soldiers that are in the war, the ways that they have experienced it and their communications with people back home, at least, to the extent that we are able to gauge that. Lisa, would you like to go ahead and respond to that to start?
So I think that the conscript issue has been brought into more attention ever since the Moskva sank, so the cruiser, the big ship. So because the parents of the conscripts have become more vocal despite the threat of repression against them. So this is an issue that's, again, looming even larger now because of the looming draft that's coming up now in spring. So which means that I would expect actually quite a bit of draft dodging in this term around. And also I've read of some of the effort from Ukrainian volunteers to try to target actually the families of potential draftees with some social media messaging. So to try and tell them about the potential of them being involved in the war. I cannot speak to those efforts, of course, but the thing is that I think that the war actually reinvigorated a lot of this very negative perception of the Russian army that existed in the 90s, for example, when there was the worst thing that could happen to an 8-year-old boy would be to be drafted into the army, at least in more urban, kind of heavily populated areas, not necessarily in rural areas where it's pretty much one of the only social elevators that you have. But for more urbanized parts of Russia, especially in the 90s, it was the worst thing that could happen to a boy. And every effort was made to either get some kind of medical exemption or to enter university, so you would be able to defer your service in the army. So this is something that was extremely popular in the 90s, and it was somewhat actually remedied by the annexation of Crimea. So this was actually when Russian militarism and the militarization of society suddenly really flourished, and this whole idea of very polite army and very qualified army, very professional army. So this is was a very new actually narrative compared to the 90s in Russia. So this is actually the time when serving in the army became suddenly kind of prestigious and not necessarily. And I don't have the numbers for draft dodging for this time around, but at least based on a lot of the militarized symbolics that was also on sale at that point in time, this is something that also is an indicator of the fact that the Russian army prestige increased. That also is another thing is also, of course, the youth, the paramilitary youth organization that also flourished in the aftermath of Crimean annexation, such as Youth Armia, for example, where those organizations are not empty. There are children in those organizations, which again is an indicator of the fact that the army prestige has grown. What will happen next? I don't know, but this kind of militarized ethos that has been consistently pumped into the Russian society since the annexation of Crimea, and kind of positive image of the army would at some point still shatter against some of the things that the Russian public will inevitably find out about the war in Ukraine.
And I think, unfortunately, the last word is going to have to go to, well, not unfortunately, but we're running out of time, unfortunately. I'd like to give the last word to Gulnaz to respond to this.
On conscripts, let me just say something I think that is important. For our expectations that number of deaths that is increasing and how it's going to affect the social and political dynamics within the country, an important thing to remember is that what we're discovering with regards to the army is that most of these people are coming from periphery and from ethnic regions, and a lot of deaths go to the families that are, to start with, not very politically efficacious, not very politically active. And that has been noted even by the committee of the mothers of soldiers, that there isn't much reaction with regards to that. Might be changing, but what we do not see is that these deaths are coming to Moscow, to Kazan. They are coming to smaller places and to faraway places where people are not quite active in terms of their political position.
Okay, we have to end it there, but I want to thank again our contributors for the very thoughtful and insightful analyses and for sharing their insights with all of us, and also to thank all of our attendees for your questions and for your interest in the subject. And we will also be posting the recording of this session on the Institute's YouTube channel in due course, and so please feel free to share with anybody else you think that might be interested, and watch the space for future discussions from Aarhus related to these ongoing developments with regards to Russia's war. So thank you all very much, and I wish you all a wonderful day.